Hi, it's Steph. Welcome back to my garden. Today I have two plants that I need to transplant, and I'm going to share with you some tips or some steps that I take in order to make sure that the transplant is successful. As we're heading into warmer weather, it's usually not a good idea to transplant things when the weather is in the 80s or 90s because it's more of a chance that your plant will go into transplant shock. Ideally, you want to transplant plants when the weather is cooler, such as in the fall or the early spring, or when the plant is dormant is usually even better. However, there are times where you just need to move a plant. In my case today, there are two plants that are not in a great spot and I need them somewhere else. So some steps that you can take in order to ensure a successful transplant is that first you want to make sure that the temperatures are going to be on the cooler side. I took a look at the forecast and we're going to be in the 70s this week. So I think that this is a good opportunity for me to move those plants. If it were going to be in the 80s or 90s, you don't want to risk moving those plants. Another thing that you should think about is the time of day. You never want to transplant plants in the middle of the day where the sun is the warmest. So what you want to do is either transplant in the early morning or in the evening as the sun is starting to set. So I'm going to share with you some additional tips that are helpful to ensure a successful transplant as the weather starts to warm up. So I don't have much time because the sun is going to start coming over to my left and into this bed. So what I'm going to do is I have this lupin here that was beautiful but just finished blooming. It is much too big for the front of the border, so I'm going to dig this up. The first step is to prep the hole of where you're going to put your transplant. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to dig this up and get this hole ready for the plant that I'm going to stick in it. But this is another reason I don't like landscape fabric. You see how my plant kind of grew through it and now it's all stuck. So it creates more work for me as a gardener to have to get rid of this now. So it's not my favorite. But this is out now and I'm gonna go ahead and prep my hole for my transplant. You're wondering why I don't like landscape fabric and there's some in this bed. Well, when I was new to gardening about 10 years ago, the landscaper who kind of was helping me plant things told me it was a good idea and it would prevent weeds. So we put it down. But now, knowing what I know today, I would never use it. I would just use newspaper or cardboard, things that will break down over time so that you can easily plant. I made sure to prep my hole by loosening up the soil and making it wide enough for my transplant. Now I'm going to put a salvia in here and they don't have a very deep root system, so I know that this is going to be sufficient for it. Now here's a tip. When you're making a transplant, I learned this from my friend Claudia over at the Organized Homemaker. I'll link her channel down below. And what she does, she's over in Georgia and they get really warm weather. And her tip is to fill your transplant hole with water, so when you put in your transplant, it already has water to drink from and it also reduces transplant shock. So I'm going to start filling it with water, and while this water is kind of absorbing into the hole, I'm going to go ahead and dig up my transplant. So this is tricky because this bed is very densely planted at the moment, but this salvia here is getting engulfed by all of my lilies and all of the foliage around it. So I'm going to go ahead and move this to the front of my double pink knockout rose. Now here is my salvia. This isn't ideal because it is already all bloomed out, and so it's going to want to topple over when I transplant it. I might have to cut this top foliage off so that it's a little bit more stable, but I needed to move it from there because it was just getting too buried. It needed space. So now that my water has started to absorb, I'm going to go ahead and plant my salvia. I'm going to add some of this fertilizer also once I get some soil around it to steady it. This is just some Espoma Biotone startup fertilizer, and it'll help with the root development. Now I am going to cut these blooms off. I just made the decision to do that because it is too tall and it's going to want to topple over. So I'm going to cut it real low, and then probably in a few weeks it'll send up a second flush. Now that your transplant is planted, we had already put some water in the planting hole to kind of already moisten it, and now you just want to water it in once you're done planting. And the goal over the next week or so is you want to make sure that you keep your plant consistently moist, not sitting in a puddle of water, but moist to prevent transplant shock. In the beginning of the video, you saw me grab this lawn chair and this small side table. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use these to shade my transplant. Get creative, you can use anything. The goal is to just provide some shade to keep it cooler during the warmer temperatures so that it also lessens your transplant shock. So depending on the height of your plant will depend what size item you need to use to shade it. Since I cut the salvia down, I'm going to go ahead and just use this small table. And I'm going to place it over my plant, and now it's providing it some shade. In this spot, I'm going to transplant a white swan echinacea. So I've already made my hole. I'm going to go ahead and throw some water in it, and then I'm going to go dig up my transplant. Here's my white swan echinacea that I'm going to transplant. Another important thing to remember when doing the transplant is you want to try to get as much of the root ball as possible. Now with the salvia I just did, it was kind of impossible because it was in a really tight space, but I'm going to do my best to get a good amount of root ball with this transplant. So right here I have my white swan echinacea. I've made sure that there was water in the hole. And another thing that you're going to make sure you have on hand is just some garden soil or some compost in case you need additional soil to finish planting your transplant. So I'm going to go ahead and just add my startup fertilizer, tuck this guy in, and water him. The last step is to go ahead and provide some shade. Now, since this plant is a little bit taller and I don't want to cut off the blooms that I have already shot up, I'm going to go ahead and use this lawn chair. Whatever you use to shade your plant, you just want to make sure that there's ventilation. You don't want to throw something like a cardboard box over it. It needs to breathe. You're literally just providing some shade. So while not ideal to transplant something when it's almost summer and the temperatures are getting warmer, if you wait for a window of a few days where it's going to be overcast or rainy or in a cooler temperature like the 70s, it can be done with a few simple steps. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.